The rope burns through skin that has never known chains. A Nubian teenager stumbles forward in the Egyptian desert heat, her throat so parched that swallowing feels like grinding sand between stones. She is 15 summers old, though the Egyptian scribes recording her capture will simply mark her as one female, young, suitable for labor. Behind her stretches a line of women from her village, her mother, her aunts, her younger sister who still cries despite having no tears left to shed. The year is 1450 BCE. Pharaoh Thutmose III has just completed his 8th military campaign into Nubia, and his victory inscriptions will boast of taking 7,000 captives. But those are just numbers carved into temple walls. This girl, whose name the Egyptians never bothered to learn, whose identity was reduced to her market value, represents the true cost of Egypt's golden age. Dust coats her skin, mixing with blood from wounds where Egyptian soldiers tested her flesh for firmness, checking their merchandise for quality. The crowds lining Thebes' streets don't see a person. They see wealth walking, prestige in chains, the pharaoh's power made flesh. Children throw date pits at her. Women spit as she passes. Men evaluate her body with the same calculating gaze they use for cattle at market. She doesn't know that within 3 days, she'll be sold to a nobleman's estate, where she'll spend the next 40 years grinding grain until her knees fuse into permanent bent position. She doesn't know her daughter, born from abuse by that nobleman's son, will inherit her slavery like a genetic curse. She doesn't know her bones will end up in an unmarked pit in the desert, denied the afterlife that Egyptians considered more important than life itself. What she knows is thirst, exhaustion. The weight of knowing her life as a free person ended the moment Egyptian bronze met Nubian shields. Here's what your history textbooks never mentioned, while glorifying pyramids and golden masks. Ancient Egypt's magnificence was built on the backs of enslaved women whose suffering was so systematically erased that we only know they existed through fragments. A mention in a tax document here. A skeleton showing signs of repetitive trauma there. Wall reliefs depicting bound women kneeling before pharaohs who are remembered as great while their victims remain nameless. Conservative estimates suggest that up to 30% of Egypt's population consisted of slaves during the New Kingdom. The majority were women, foreign women captured in wars, local women sold for debt, children born into bondage, who never knew freedom existed. These women ground the grain that fed Egypt. They wove the linen that clothed priests. They built the monuments we admire today with their blood mixed into the mortar. But Egypt didn't just enslave bodies. It developed sophisticated systems for breaking spirits, erasing identities, ensuring that these women understood they were property, not people. From the moment of capture through death and even beyond, female slaves faced horrors that Egyptian records barely acknowledge because, to Egyptians, the suffering of property wasn't worth documenting. What you're about to learn will forever change how you see those museum exhibits of Egyptian glory. Behind every golden artifact was a woman who mined the ore while chained. Within every piece of fine linen was the blood from fingers worked raw at the loom. Beneath every monument lies the bones of women whose names were never recorded, whose deaths weren't mourned, whose humanity was denied so completely that their existence was reduced to entries in inventory lists between cattle and grain. Before diving into these forgotten stories of institutional cruelty, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. War in ancient Egypt wasn't just about territory or resources. It was a shopping expedition for human livestock, and women were the preferred merchandise. When Pharaoh Amenhotep II returned from his Syrian campaign in 1420 BCE, his victory stele at Memphis didn't just record conquered cities or plundered gold. It meticulously cataloged human captures: 3,600 Apiru women, 15,200 Shasu women, 36,300 women from various Canaanite cities. These weren't warriors defeated in battle. These were mothers, daughters, sisters, and grandmothers systematically harvested from conquered populations. The Egyptian military had perfected the science of human capture. After defeating enemy armies, specialized units would sweep through civilian areas with ruthless efficiency. They targeted women specifically because they were easier to transport, less likely to rebel, and more valuable in slave markets. Young women brought highest prices. Pregnant women were considered bonus investments, 2 slaves for the price of 1 capture. Elderly women who couldn't march were killed on sight, their bodies left as warnings. The selection process was methodical and dehumanizing. Egyptian soldiers would line up captured women for inspection. They checked teeth to estimate age, felt muscles to assess work capacity, examined breasts to determine if they could serve as wet nurses. Women were stripped naked and sorted into categories: domestic servants, field workers, concubines, temple servants. The sorting happened in full view of their captured families, adding psychological torture to physical captivity. Temple reliefs at Medinet Habu show these scenes with disturbing pride. Rows of bound women kneel before Pharaoh Ramesses III, their arms tied behind their backs in positions that would cause permanent nerve damage. Children cling to their mothers' legs. The artistic convention shows foreign women with their ethnic features exaggerated to emphasize their otherness, their non-Egyptian status that made their enslavement acceptable, even celebrated. The march back to Egypt was designed to break spirits before bodies reached markets. Women were roped together at the neck, creating human chains where one person's stumbling meant strangulation risk for all. No provisions were made for biological needs. Women menstruating, pregnant, or nursing had to keep pace or die. The Egyptian military calculated that losing 20% of captives during transport was acceptable overhead. Contemporary records from Deir el-Medina, the village of royal tomb builders, describe the arrival of these human caravans. The women would be paraded through towns, displayed as evidence of Pharaoh's power. Local populations would gather to mock, assault, and degrade the captives. This public humiliation served dual purposes: reinforcing Egyptian superiority and beginning the psychological process of convincing these women they were less than human. The slave markets themselves operated with bureaucratic efficiency. The Edwin Smith Papyrus mentions price standardizations. A young Syrian woman cost 2 deben of silver, while a Nubian girl might fetch 3 if she showed particular beauty or skill. Women were made to demonstrate abilities that might increase their value. Could they weave, dance, speak multiple languages? Each skill meant higher prices, though it also meant more sophisticated exploitation. Families were deliberately separated to prevent solidarity and resistance. Mothers were sold away from daughters. Sisters were dispersed to different cities. Children young enough to forget their origins were prized because they could be molded into perfect slaves without memories of freedom. The destruction of family bonds was so systematic that Egyptian vocabulary for slaves often used terms related to orphanhood and isolation. But capture and sale were just the beginning. What awaited these women in Egyptian households, temples, and fields would make them prey for the quick death they were denied on the battlefield. The daily reality of female slavery in Egypt was calibrated to extract maximum labor while maintaining minimum humanity, creating a system where women were worked quite literally to death. Every morning before Ra's light touched the pyramids, enslaved women across Egypt were already destroying their bodies in service to masters who saw them as tools with unfortunate needs for food and rest. The grinding of grain alone killed thousands through slow, joint-destroying torture. Egyptian households demanded fresh bread daily, requiring hours of crushing wheat between heavy stones. Enslaved women knelt for up to 16 hours per day, pushing and pulling grinding stones that weighed more than small children. The repetitive motion destroyed cartilage in knees, fused vertebrae and spines, and created arthritis so severe that excavated skeletons show women in their 20s with joint degeneration, typical of modern 80-year-olds. Recent archaeological analysis of female skeletons from worker cemeteries near Giza reveals the catastrophic toll. Compression fractures in the spine from carrying impossible loads. Teeth worn flat from accidentally consuming stone dust mixed with flour. Malformed arm bones from repetitive grinding motions. These women's skeletons tell stories their masters never recorded. Stories of bodies transformed into machines, worn out and discarded. The water-carrying duties created their own distinctive deformities. Clay jars filled with water from the Nile weighed up to 60 pounds. Enslaved women balanced these on their heads while climbing steep banks and walking miles to deliver water for drinking, cooking, and bathing. The constant pressure compressed cervical vertebrae, causing excruciating headaches and eventual paralysis. Tomb paintings show these water carriers with characteristic forward-bent necks, a posture that became permanent as bones reformed under constant weight. But physical labor was just the foundation of their suffering. These women endured casual violence that Egyptian law didn't just permit but codified. The Papyrus Brooklyn, a legal document from the Middle Kingdom, lists acceptable punishments for slaves, including beating with rods, whipping with hippopotamus hide strips, and forced labor in deadly conditions. Female slaves could be beaten for working too slowly, spilling water, burning bread, or simply existing within reach of an angry master. Kitchen duties meant constant burns from open fires and hot oils. Laundry work involved handling natron, a caustic salt that ate through skin, leaving chemical burns that never properly healed. Stable cleaning exposed women to diseases from animal waste. Every task assigned to female slaves carried inherent dangers that free Egyptians avoided by forcing others to face them. The tomb of Rekhmire, vizier under Thutmose III, contains detailed paintings of his household operations. Among the scenes of abundance and luxury, enslaved women appear as silent fixtures. One kneels holding the vizier's sandals, her posture indicating she's been in that position for hours. Another stands behind his chair with a fan, condemned to wave it continuously through entire banquets. These paintings, meant to ensure Rekhmire's comfort in the afterlife, inadvertently document the women whose exhaustion provided his earthly comfort. Textile production created its own unique agonies. Linen, Egypt's primary fabric, required processing flax through multiple stages, each demanding different forms of bodily destruction. Women beat dried flax with wooden mallets until fibers separated, filling their lungs with dust that caused respiratory diseases. They soaked fibers in water mixed with urine to soften them, developing skin diseases from constant exposure to waste. They spun thread until their fingers bled, then wove on looms that required maintaining stress positions for hours. One papyrus from Deir el-Medina records a complaint from a tomb painter whose allocated slave woman had died after only 3 years of service. He demands replacement, noting she had become inefficient in her final months. The casual tone suggests this was routine. Women worked until their bodies failed, then were replaced like broken tools. No mention of her name, age, or origin. She existed in the record only as an inconvenience to her owner. Agricultural labor during harvest season pushed female slaves beyond physical limits. They worked fields from dawn to dusk under the desert sun, forbidden from seeking shade. They gleaned after male harvesters, bending constantly to gather fallen grain, developing permanent spinal curvatures. During inundation season, when fields flooded, they were sent to quarries to cut stone or to desert mines to extract gold, assignments that were effectively death sentences. Medical papyri occasionally mention treating slaves, but only when their condition threatened productivity. The Ebers Papyrus includes remedies for maintaining slave health, focusing on keeping them functional rather than comfortable. Broken bones might be set if the slave was valuable. Infections might be treated if they threatened to spread, but chronic pain, exhaustion, and gradual deterioration were considered normal wear on human property. The few enslaved women who survived to old age faced new horrors. Too broken to work, but too expensive to maintain, they were often abandoned to die. Some were dumped in the desert. Others were walled into storage rooms and forgotten. The lucky ones might be allowed to train younger slaves, passing on skills along with the accumulated trauma of decades of abuse. Yet even this grinding daily existence wasn't the worst fate. Some women were taken not for their labor but for their bodies, entering a world where abuse was reframed as privilege and sexual slavery disguised as honor. Egyptian texts never use words like abuse or sexual assault when describing what happened to enslaved women. They use taking, enjoying, using, language that reveals how completely these women's humanity was erased from consciousness. The Amarna letters, diplomatic correspondence between Egypt and other Bronze Age powers, discuss women as explicitly as they discuss gold shipments. A letter from the king of Babylon complains that the women Pharaoh sent as gifts were not attractive enough for royal standards. Another from the Mitanni king offers his daughter and 300 accomplished female servants as part of a treaty negotiation. These weren't marriages or employment contracts. These were transfers of sexual property between powerful men who collected women like living trophies. Pharaonic harems weren't oriental fantasies, but carefully administered abuse institutions. The great royal wife held official status, but beneath her ranked hundreds of foreign women gifted by defeated kingdoms or captured in raids. Palace records from the reign of Ramesses III list 416 foreign women in the royal harem, catalogued by origin like exotic animals: 93 Syrians, 42 Nubians, 31 Libyans. The list continues with mechanical precision. These women existed solely for royal pleasure and reproductive purposes. They couldn't refuse summons, they couldn't choose partners, they couldn't protect their daughters from the same fate. The term royal ornament, their official designation, reveals their status as decorative objects that happen to breathe. When pharaohs died, these women were sometimes passed to successors like furniture, their trauma compounded by decades of different owners. But royal sexual slavery was mirrored throughout Egyptian society. Any man who could afford female slaves could use them sexually without legal or social consequence. The instructions of Tahotep, an ancient wisdom text, advises men to plow their fields and plant their seeds widely, an agricultural metaphor for abuse that reveals how normalized sexual violence against enslaved women had become. Temple prostitution added religious legitimacy to sexual slavery. Women designated as temple musicians or divine servants were required to provide sexual services during religious festivals. The Temple of Mut at Karnak employed hundreds of foreign women in these roles, their abuse reframed as worship. They were tattooed with religious symbols that marked them as sacred property, unable to escape even if freed because their bodies bore permanent marks of sexual availability. The children born from these systematic abuse methods inherited their mother's slavery. Egyptian law was clear. Children of slave women were slaves regardless of their father's status. A nobleman might abuse his slave, produce children, then sell those children, his own offspring, for profit. The psychological torture of women watching their children, products of their own abuse, sold as property, defies comprehension. Some enslaved women were specifically purchased as breeders, valued for their fertility rather than labor capacity. They were paired with male slaves or used by masters to produce more slaves, their wombs becoming factories for human property. Medical papyri describe fertility treatments administered to enslaved women, not out of concern for their well-being, but to maximize their reproductive output. The adoption papyrus from the 11th dynasty describes a barren wife purchasing a Syrian slave woman specifically to bear children for the household. The document details how the slave would be impregnated by the woman's husband, the children claimed by the wife, and the slave retained as wet nurse and servant to her own biological children who would never acknowledge her as mother. Entertainment slavery created public spectacles of sexual humiliation. Foreign women were forced to perform exotic dances at banquets, their movements designed to titillate Egyptian audiences who saw them as erotic curiosities rather than human beings. Tomb paintings show these performances, women in transparent garments or naked, dancing while Egyptian guests recline on couches, watching these displays of culturally alien bodies forced into sexualized performance. Young girls faced particularly horrific fates. Prepubescent female slaves were prepared for future sexual service through systematic abuse disguised as training. They were taught to anticipate male desires, to perform without resistance, to display enthusiasm for their own violation. This grooming began as young as 7 or 8, destroying childhoods and creating women who knew no existence beyond sexual servitude. The medical consequences of constant abuse were devastating but ignored unless they threatened the slave's utility. Pregnancy complications killed countless enslaved women who received no prenatal care. Sexually transmitted infections spread unchecked through slave populations. Genital injuries from violent assaults were treated only if they prevented future use. Women's bodies were battlegrounds where they had no weapons, no defenses, no hope of victory. Some women attempted suicide rather than endure continued sexual slavery, but even death required permission in ancient Egypt. Slaves who killed themselves were considered thieves who had stolen property, their master's property, from their owners. If caught attempting suicide, punishments were designed to make death seem merciful by comparison. The psychological frameworks that enabled this sexual slavery persist in how we discuss ancient Egypt today. Museum exhibits celebrate the beauty of Egyptian art without acknowledging that many depicted women were sex slaves. Academic texts describe harems as symbols of royal prestige rather than institutionalized abuse facilities. We admire Egyptian civilization while ignoring that its power structure was built on the systematic sexual violation of enslaved women. Yet, even abuse was not the depths of degradation. The Egyptian system of slavery required visible markers, permanent modifications that ensured escaped slaves could never disappear into free populations. The body itself became a prison. Flesh remembers trauma in ways that transcend time. The burn scars on enslaved women in ancient Egypt were maps of ownership, each mark telling the story of possession, punishment, and the impossibility of escape. Branding was the most common and visible form of marking slaves. Unlike the discreet marks sometimes used on valuable property, brands on enslaved women were designed for maximum visibility and humiliation. The hieroglyphic symbols for property or specific owner names were burned into cheeks, foreheads, and hands, places that couldn't be hidden by clothing. The process was deliberately slow, the heated bronze pressed against skin long enough to ensure scarring that would last a lifetime. A Middle Kingdom papyrus describes the branding ceremony for newly acquired slaves. The women would be held down by multiple men while a priest, because even torture required religious sanction in Egypt, recited spells that supposedly made the mark sacred. The smell of burning flesh filled the air. The screams echoed through courtyards. Other slaves were forced to watch, learning that their bodies were canvases for their owners' signatures. But branding was just the beginning. Tattooing served different purposes, encoding information about a slave's origins, skills, and sexual availability directly onto skin. Nubian women were marked with geometric patterns that Egyptian owners found exotic and therefore arousing. Syrian women received different designs. The tattoos weren't decorative choices, but forced modifications that turned bodies into readable texts of servitude. Recent analysis of female mummies from Deir el-Bahari revealed extensive tattooing on women identified as dancers and musicians, likely enslaved entertainers. The patterns, concentrated on thighs, lower backs, and breasts, were positioned for maximum visibility during performances. These women couldn't even die without their bodies proclaiming their enslaved status, the tattoos surviving on mummified skin 3,000 years after death. Head shaving served as both punishment and marking. Free Egyptian women prized their elaborate hairstyles, spending hours on grooming and ornamentation. Enslaved women had their heads forcibly shaved, marked as property through absence rather than addition. But the shaving wasn't clean or careful. It was done with crude bronze blades that left cuts and scars, intentionally damaging scalp tissue so hair would grow back patchy and irregular if it grew back at all. Some owners went further, using caustic substances to permanently destroy hair follicles on their slaves' heads. The bald scalp would then be tattooed with ownership marks or decorative patterns that pleased the master's aesthetic. These women walked through Egyptian society with their subjugation literally written on their heads, unable to hide their status even momentarily. Whipping created its own language of ownership. Different whip types left distinctive scars that experienced observers could read. The hippopotamus hide whip left thick, raised welts. The split reed created thin, parallel lines. The knotted rope produced circular burn marks. A slave's back became a historical record of every infraction, real or imagined, that had earned punishment. The Egyptian overseer's whip, the nekhacha, became so symbolically important that pharaohs carried ceremonial versions as symbols of power. What we see in museums as royal regalia were representations of instruments used to torture enslaved women. The crook and flail that crossed Tutankhamun's mummified chest represented the dual nature of power, guidance for the worthy, violence for the enslaved. Legal papyri document acceptable punishment levels for slaves: 20 lashes for spoiling food, 40 for attempting escape, 100 for striking a free person. The numbers seem clinical until you understand that 20 lashes with a hippopotamus hide whip could expose bone, 40 could cause permanent nerve damage. 100 was often fatal, with death coming not from the whipping itself, but from infections and wounds that were never treated. Ear piercing might seem benign compared to branding and whipping, but in ancient Egypt it carried specific meaning. Multiple piercings in specific patterns marked women as property. Large holes stretched through earlobes allowed for locks, actual metal locks, to be attached, physically securing women to posts or chains when not in use. The weight of these locks eventually tore through flesh, leaving ears permanently deformed. Dental modification added another layer of visible marking. Front teeth were filed into points, or specific patterns that identified slaves and their origins. The process, done without anesthesia using bronze files, caused excruciating pain and permanent sensitivity. These women could never eat normally again, cold or hot food causing shooting pains through damaged nerves. Every meal became a reminder of their modification. The most sadistic marking involved deliberate mutilation disguised as decoration. Some owners had their female slaves' lips tattooed or scarred into permanent smiles, creating grotesque parodies of happiness on faces that had forgotten joy. Others had symbols carved into skin and packed with colored sand that would heal into raised, tinted scars. These decorative mutilations turned enslaved women into living art pieces, their suffering transformed into their owners' aesthetic statements. Pregnancy created temporary reprieve from some punishments, but brought its own markers. Enslaved women who bore children had their bellies tattooed or branded with symbols indicating how many offspring they had produced. These marks served as quality indicators in slave markets, advertising proven fertility. A woman's reproductive history was literally written on her skin for potential buyers to evaluate. Even clothing became a form of marking. Enslaved women were forbidden from wearing certain colors, fabrics, or styles reserved for free Egyptians. They were given rough linen garments designed to chafe and irritate skin, creating distinctive rashes and calluses that marked them as surely as brands. The clothing was intentionally inadequate for desert temperature extremes, ensuring slaves suffered from cold at night and heat during day. Foot binding, though not as extreme as later Chinese practices, was used on some enslaved women to limit mobility. Tight bindings during childhood created permanent deformities that made running impossible. These women developed distinctive gaits that announced their status with every step. They couldn't escape because their own bodies had been modified to prevent it. The cumulative effect of these markings was complete dehumanization. A branded, tattooed, scarred, shaved woman couldn't blend into crowds. She couldn't claim to be free. She couldn't escape her status, even in death, because mummification, when rarely granted to slaves, preserved these modifications for eternity. But the individual punishments and markings were just preparation for the public spectacles where enslaved women's humiliation became entertainment for free Egyptians. Ancient Egypt turned the degradation of enslaved women into religious festivals, victory celebrations, and public entertainment that reinforced social hierarchies through orchestrated suffering. When Pharaoh returned from military campaigns, the celebration began with a parade of captured women through major cities. These weren't simple processions, but carefully choreographed displays of dominance. The women were arranged by ethnicity and perceived beauty, creating a living catalog of Egyptian conquest. They were stripped to loincloths or completely naked, their skin painted with symbols of defeat, their hair, if not already shaved, styled in humiliating ways that mocked their cultural traditions. The route through Memphis or Thebes was designed to maximize exposure, through market districts where merchants would evaluate them like livestock, past temples where priests would declare their capture divinely ordained, around palace complexes where nobles would select future servants. The march could take an entire day, without water, without rest, without any acknowledgement of their humanity beyond the crowd's evaluation of their bodies. Temple reliefs from Karnak and Luxor depict these processions with disturbing pride. Rows of bound women stumble forward, their faces carved to show anguish that Egyptian artists usually reserved for demons and enemies of order. Children are shown clinging to their mothers, but separated by ropes, able to see but not touch. The artistic convention makes the conquered women smaller than Egyptians, visually reinforcing their diminished status. But parades were just the beginning. Festival entertainment regularly featured enslaved women forced into degrading performances. During the Opet festival, foreign women were made to dance their native dances while Egyptians mocked and threw food at them. The women had to continue dancing, smiling, pretending joy while being pelted with rotten vegetables and animal waste. These performances lasted hours, with women collapsing from exhaustion considered part of the entertainment. The Feast of Drunkenness, celebrating the goddess Hathor, involved forcing enslaved women to serve wine to increasingly intoxicated free Egyptians who would grope, assault, and humiliate them as part of the religious celebration. The women couldn't resist, couldn't complain, couldn't even show displeasure without facing severe punishment. They had to endure sexual assault as religious practice, their violation considered pleasing to the gods. Competition spectacles pitted enslaved women against each other for Egyptian amusement. They were forced to fight for food, with winners earning meals and losers going hungry. They were made to race while carrying impossible loads, with the slowest facing public whipping. These competitions were presented as entertainment at noble banquets, with guests placing bets on which woman would collapse first. The ritual humiliation extended to religious ceremonies. During the annual flooding of the Nile, enslaved women were sometimes thrown into the river as offerings to ensure good harvests. Most couldn't swim. The crowds would watch them struggle, interpreting their drowning as divine acceptance of the sacrifice. Those who somehow survived were considered rejected by the gods, and faced even worse treatment as spiritually contaminated property. Mock executions provided particularly sadistic entertainment. Enslaved women who had committed minor infractions would be subjected to fake drownings, partial strangulations, or threatened burnings, brought to the edge of death for crowd amusement before being revived to face the experience again. The psychological torture of repeated near-death experiences, performed publicly for entertainment, destroyed minds as thoroughly as whips destroyed bodies. Sexual humiliation was incorporated into public punishments. Women accused of theft or laziness might be stripped and displayed in market squares for days, available for any passerby to touch, prod, or assault. The public nature of the sexual violation was the point, demonstrating that these women's bodies were public property, accessible to any free Egyptian who wished to use them. The birth of enslaved children became public events in wealthy households. The woman would be forced to give birth in courtyards where the household could watch, commenting on her pain, taking bets on the child's gender, celebrating if it was healthy enough to become valuable property, or expressing disappointment if it seemed weak. The most intimate, vulnerable moment of a woman's life transformed into spectator sport. Religious prostitution during festivals meant enslaved women were stationed at temple entrances, required to service any pilgrim who made an offering. These public displays of violence were considered acts of worship, the woman's suffering supposedly pleasing to gods who demanded foreign flesh as tribute. The women had to perform enthusiasm, displaying false pleasure to enhance the religious experience of their abusers. Dance performances went beyond simple entertainment. Enslaved women were forced to reenact their own captures, performing choreographed versions of their villages being destroyed, their families killed, themselves being taken. They had to dance their own trauma for Egyptian pleasure, transforming their worst memories into entertainment. The psychological sadism of forcing women to perform their own defeats created wounds that never healed. The arena combats, though less common than in Rome, did exist in Egyptian entertainment. Enslaved women were sometimes forced to fight animals or each other with primitive weapons. These weren't trained gladiators, but terrified women given knives and told that only survivors would eat that day. The crowds cheered injuries, laughed at terror, applauded deaths. Public medical examinations added another layer of humiliation. When enslaved women were suspected of pregnancy or disease, they were examined in public squares by physicians who would loudly announce their findings. Intimate medical details became public knowledge. Bodies were exposed and prodded while crowds watched, turning healthcare into another form of entertainment. The harvest festivals included rituals where enslaved women were symbolically plowed like fields, forced to lie in furrows while priests performed fertility ceremonies over them. The sexual symbolism was explicit and degrading, reducing women to soil to be planted with seed. These ceremonies were considered essential for ensuring good harvests, making enslaved women's humiliation a religious necessity. Children were brought to watch these spectacles as education. They learned that foreign women deserved degradation, that slavery was natural, that suffering was entertainment when it happened to property rather than people. Generation after generation internalized these lessons, perpetuating systems of oppression that seemed divinely ordained because they had always existed. Even death couldn't end the humiliation. The bodies of enslaved women who died during public spectacles were often left on display as warnings. Their corpses were positioned in degrading poses, sometimes preserved with salt to extend the display. The denial of proper burial meant their humiliation extended beyond death, their bodies continuing to serve as entertainment even as they decomposed. But for all the horrors of life, it was in death that Egyptian slavery revealed its ultimate cruelty. The same civilization that obsessed over afterlife preparation condemned enslaved women to eternal non-existence. In a civilization that spent more resources on death than life, where pyramids dwarfed palaces and tomb goods exceeded lifetime possessions, enslaved women were denied even the mercy of a dignified death. When an enslaved woman's body finally failed after decades of labor, violence, and abuse, her death was noted only as an inventory adjustment. A papyrus from the 20th dynasty records, "The Syrian woman called Small has died. Replacement requested for grain grinding." 30 years of suffering reduced to a single line of administrative text. No name beyond a descriptor of her size. No mention of burial. Just a request for replacement property. The disposal of enslaved bodies followed patterns that archaeologists are only now beginning to understand. Mass burial pits near pyramid construction sites contain primarily female skeletons showing signs of severe trauma and malnutrition. These weren't proper graves, but dumping grounds, bodies thrown in without ceremony, without goods for the afterlife, without even the basic respect of positioning that Egyptians gave to animals. Recent excavations at Amarna, Akhenaten's capital, revealed a workers' cemetery containing thousands of skeletons, 60% female. The bodies show evidence of brutal lives: spines compressed from carrying massive loads, bones broken and healed incorrectly without medical treatment, teeth worn to nubs from grain contaminated with sand. But most telling is what's absent: no grave goods, no inscriptions, no evidence of mummification. These women were denied the afterlife that Egyptians considered the entire purpose of existence. The religious implications of this denial went beyond simple cruelty. Egyptians believed that without proper burial rites, the soul couldn't reach the afterlife. Without mummification, the body couldn't be restored in the field of reeds. Without grave goods, the spirit would starve in the darkness. Enslaved women weren't just killed. They were condemned to eternal non-existence, their souls trapped in a limbo that Egyptians considered worse than any hell. Free Egyptians spent their entire lives preparing for death. They commissioned tomb paintings, showing themselves young and healthy. They accumulated treasures to accompany them. They paid for priests to perform rituals, ensuring safe passage through the underworld. Enslaved women watched these preparations, knowing they would receive none of them. They served in households where pet cats received better burial treatment than they ever would. The mummification process, when rarely applied to valuable slaves, was a crude mockery of proper preservation. Instead of carefully removing organs and preserving them in canopic jars, enslaved bodies were simply dried in natron salt, creating desiccated corpses rather than true mummies. No amulets were placed between wrappings, no spells written on linen, no masks to restore their faces in the afterlife. Even in preservation, they were marked as lesser. Some enslaved women were buried in positions of servitude, their skeletons found kneeling or prostrated, as if still serving masters, even in death. This positioning was intentional, a final humiliation, suggesting they would continue serving in whatever limited afterlife they might achieve. Their bones bear witness to final moments spent forced into submissive postures that became permanent as rigor mortis set in. The shallow desert burials created their own horrors. Bodies were barely covered with sand, left exposed to scavengers. Jackals and vultures would disturb the graves, scattering bones across the desert. The living enslaved women would see these scattered remains, knowing their own bodies would suffer the same fate. The psychological torture of seeing your future desecration added another layer to daily suffering. Disease casualties among enslaved women were handled with particular callousness. During plague outbreaks, sick slaves were often abandoned in the desert before death, removed from households to prevent contamination. These women died alone, without water, without comfort. Their final moments spent crawling through sand, seeking shade that didn't exist. Their bones are still being discovered, isolated skeletons far from any settlement, testimony to lonely deaths. Pregnancy deaths, common given the lack of medical care and constant labor demanded even from heavily pregnant women, resulted in especially undignified disposal. The bodies of women who died in childbirth were considered unlucky, contaminated by the failure to produce new property. They were burned rather than buried, their ashes scattered to prevent any spiritual contamination. The children who died with them weren't even acknowledged as having existed. Work accidents that killed enslaved women were treated as property damage rather than human tragedy. A woman crushed by falling stone at a construction site would be dragged away and replaced before work resumed. Her blood would be mixed into mortar, literally building Egyptian monuments with the essence of enslaved women. Modern chemical analysis of pyramid mortar has found human blood proteins, silent testimony to bodies that became part of the structures they died building. Suicide, the only escape some women could imagine, was prevented through architectural cruelty. Sleeping quarters were designed to prevent hanging. Tools were collected after use to prevent self-harm. Women showing signs of despair were chained to prevent them from throwing themselves into the Nile. Even the choice of death was denied, forcing them to endure until their bodies failed naturally. The treatment of elderly enslaved women who could no longer work efficiently was particularly cruel. Some were walled into storage rooms and left to die of starvation. Others were abandoned in the desert during the household's seasonal moves. The lucky ones might be killed quickly, their deaths framed as mercy. Archaeological evidence shows female skeletons with cut marks on neck vertebrae, suggesting throat slitting as a disposal method for women too old to serve. Mass graves tell stories of periodic cullings. When economic downturns made maintaining slaves expensive, when new captives made older slaves redundant, when plagues threatened to spread, enslaved women were killed en masse. Dozens of female skeletons in single pits, some showing signs of violence, others suggesting poisoning. These killings were economic decisions, disposing of depreciated assets. Children watched their mothers' bodies thrown into pits. Mothers saw their daughters' corpses fed to crocodiles. Sisters witnessed each other's remains scattered by scavengers. The trauma of improper burial, of knowing your loved ones were denied afterlife, created psychological wounds that lasted through generations. Enslaved women lived with the constant knowledge that their deaths would be meaningless, their bodies trash, their souls condemned to eternal darkness. The absence of enslaved women from tomb paintings reveals another form of erasure. In scenes depicting daily life, enslaved women appear as furniture, holding fans, carrying jars, but never as individuals. When tombs were sealed, the real enslaved women who had served the deceased were sometimes killed to continue serving in the afterlife, but their murders weren't commemorated. They died unnamed, their sacrifice unrecorded, their afterlife service assumed, but never acknowledged. Recent DNA analysis of mummies has revealed that some women buried as servants in royal tombs were killed specifically for burial, their throats cut or their skulls crushed to ensure they would accompany their masters immediately. These weren't volunteers, but murdered slaves, their final earthly act being forced to die for owners who had tormented them in life and would supposedly continue owning them in death. But even this ultimate degradation wasn't the absolute worst fate. Some women were selected for an honor that was actually the cruelest fate imaginable, dying to serve not just in the afterlife, but as eternal slaves in divine tombs. The ultimate horror of Egyptian slavery wasn't death, but the promise of slavery extending beyond death into eternity itself. During Egypt's first dynasty, around 3000 BCE, the tombs at Abydos reveal a practice so disturbing that later Egyptians would abandon it and try to forget it existed. When King Jair died, he didn't go into the afterlife alone. Surrounding his burial chamber, archaeologists found the remains of 318 individuals, most of them young women between 15 and 25 years old. These weren't honored courtiers who chose to follow their king. These were enslaved women, killed specifically to serve him forever. The skeletal evidence tells a story of coordinated mass murder disguised as religious ceremony. The women were dressed in their finest garments, what passed for finery in slave quarters. They were given a final meal, evidenced by food remains in their stomach cavities. Then they were poisoned, probably with opium-laced wine that would have made them drowsy before death arrived. They died in neat rows, positioned as if sleeping, maintaining servant postures even as poison stopped their hearts. But some weren't given the mercy of poison. Strangulation marks on cervical vertebrae suggest certain women were ritually strangled with cords. Others show signs of having their throats cut. The variety of killing methods might have had ritual significance, different types of death, creating different types of eternal servants. Or it might simply reflect the logistics of killing hundreds of women quickly enough to enter them before decomposition began. The positioning of these bodies reveals the intended eternal social structure. Closest to the king's chamber were young, attractive women, likely concubines expected to provide sexual service in the afterlife. Next came domestic servants, buried with tools of their trade, grinding stones, cooking pots, cleaning implements. They would continue their labor forever. The outer rings contained older women, perhaps supervisors who would maintain order among the eternal slave population. Later, dynasties replaced human sacrifice with shabtai figurines, small statues that would magically become servants in the afterlife. But the transition wasn't immediate or complete. Second dynasty tombs show fewer sacrifice servants, but still include some human victims. The practice gradually declined, not from moral evolution, but from economic pragmatism. Killing hundreds of slaves for each royal burial was wasteful, when those slaves could produce value through continued labor. Yet even as human sacrifice officially ended, the concept persisted in evolved forms. Enslaved women who died naturally during a pharaoh's lifetime were sometimes preserved and stored, waiting to be buried with their master when he died. Storage rooms near royal tomb complexes have been found containing mummified bodies that waited years or even decades for burial, enslaved women whose corpses were property to be deployed when needed. The construction of royal tombs themselves claimed thousands of enslaved women's lives. The village of Deir el-Medina, home to tomb builders, included a large enslaved population, predominantly female, who served the craftsmen. When tombs were completed and sealed, some of these women were sealed inside, whether by accident or design remains debated. Their skeletons are found in side passages, in positions suggesting they were alive when sealed in, dying of suffocation in the darkness. The belief that enslaved women would continue serving in the afterlife affected how they were treated while dying. Women showing signs of terminal illness were sometimes moved to tomb complexes, kept alive artificially until the precise moment their master died, then killed to ensure simultaneous entry into the afterlife. The timing was considered crucial for proper eternal servitude. Some royal women demanded enslaved companions for their own afterlives. Queen Neithhotep's tomb included the bodies of several young women, buried alive based on the positioning of their skeletons, hands clawing at the sealed entrance. These women spent their final moments in absolute darkness, suffocating slowly, their screams muffled by tons of stone, all to ensure a queen wouldn't be lonely in eternity. The magical texts, buried with royalty, included spells for controlling servant spirits in the afterlife. These spells reveal Egyptian beliefs about eternal slavery. The dead servants would have no will of their own, no rest, no reward, just endless labor for masters who owned them across the boundary of death. The spells specifically mention preventing servant spirits from rebelling, suggesting fear that enslaved women might seek revenge in the afterlife. Child sacrifices added another dimension of horror. Young girls, some as young as 5 or 6 based on skeletal remains, were killed to serve as eternal children for royalty who wanted to maintain parental roles in the afterlife. These children were dressed as miniature adults, their faces painted with makeup, their bodies positioned as if playing or serving. The innocence of childhood perverted into eternal servitude. The selection process for sacrificial servants was methodical. Physical examinations determined which women were healthy enough to be valuable eternal servants. Skills were assessed. Could they weave in the afterlife? Cook? Provide sexual services? Women were chosen for sacrifice based on their potential usefulness in eternity, their living skills determining their dying fate. Religious preparation for sacrifice involved weeks of rituals that combined honors with horrors. The selected women were fed better food, given better clothing, treated with relative kindness. But they were also isolated from other slaves to prevent solidarity or rebellion. They were forced to participate in prayers for their own deaths, to thank the gods for the honor of eternal servitude. The psychological torture of being prepared for murder while being told it was privilege created profound trauma. Some women resisted. Scratches on tomb walls suggest struggles. Skeletons found in non-ritual positions indicate women who fought their killers. One First Dynasty tomb contained a woman whose bones showed defensive wounds on her arms, evidence she fought back against sacrificial murder. But resistance was futile against the machinery of royal death. The economics of human sacrifice created perverse incentives. Slave traders knew that healthy, skilled young women might be purchased specifically for sacrifice, commanding premium prices. Parents sold daughters, knowing they would be killed for royal burials, but accepting the payment because it might feed surviving children. The market for sacrificial humans operated alongside markets for grain and gold. As human sacrifice declined, symbolic alternatives emerged that still centered on enslaved women's suffering. Paintings of servants on tomb walls were believed to come alive in the afterlife, but these paintings were often created by forcing enslaved women to pose for hours in uncomfortable positions, while artists captured their forms. The women suffered to create images of themselves that would suffer eternally. The Shabtai replacement figures were sometimes crafted using hair, blood, or ground bone from enslaved women, incorporating their essence into the figurines. The women weren't killed but were forced to provide pieces of themselves for their master's eternal service. A strand of hair plucked for a Shabtai meant part of that woman would serve forever in the afterlife while she continued suffering in life. The psychological impact on enslaved communities of knowing that death brought no release was devastating. Many cultures promise paradise, or at least peace after death. Egyptian slaves knew that death might mean transition from temporal slavery to eternal servitude. The absence of hope, the knowledge that suffering transcended death, created despair that Egyptian texts occasionally acknowledge as the disease of servants. Modern excavations continue to uncover evidence of sacrifice and eternal servitude. Each discovered skeleton represents not just a death but a cosmological crime, a human being condemned to slavery that transcended mortality. The bones of these women, these eternal slaves, are finally being studied, named when possible, given the dignity in archaeological record that they were denied in life and death. We return to that Nubian teenager, stumbling through Theban streets in chains, not knowing that 3,000 years later, archaeologists would find her bones in an unmarked pit near the nobleman's estate where she spent 40 years grinding grain. They identified her through the distinctive wear patterns on her skeleton. Knees fused at 90-degree angles from decades of kneeling, spine compressed and twisted from endless grinding motions, teeth worn flat from stone dust and flour, arms showing repetitive stress, fractures that healed wrong without treatment. She lived to 55, ancient by slave standards, her body a catalog of accumulated suffering that outlasted papyrus records. No Egyptian text records her name. No inscription marks her grave. No goods accompanied her into whatever afterlife she might have found. She exists in history only through the damage written in her bones, a life reconstructed from trauma patterns, a human being whose identity was erased, but whose suffering left indelible marks. She was one of millions, enslaved women whose blood mixed with pyramid mortar, whose children inherited bondage like eye color, whose bodies were used, broken, and discarded with less ceremony than Egyptians gave to sacred bulls, whose humanities were so thoroughly denied that we only know they existed through fragments, a mention in an inventory, a skeleton in a mass grave, a figure holding a fan in a tomb painting, forever frozen in servitude. Stand before the Great Pyramid of Giza and understand that you're looking at a monument built on feminine suffering. Each precisely placed stone represents countless hours of enslaved women's labor, quarrying limestone while chained, hauling water for workers, cooking food they couldn't eat, washing clothes they couldn't wear, bearing children who would inherit their chains. Walk through the Egyptian Museum in Cairo and recognize that every golden artifact was mined by enslaved women working in conditions that killed most within 5 years. Every piece of fine linen was woven by women whose fingers bled from working the fibers. Every piece of jewelry adorned queens, while the women who crafted it were branded like cattle. The magnificent temples at Karnak and Luxor echo with silenced screams. The pillars that tourists photograph were raised using ramps built by enslaved women carrying dirt in baskets that compressed their spines. The hieroglyphs that scholars translate were carved while enslaved women held scaffolding, their bodies becoming architecture's invisible foundation. Egypt gave humanity writing, mathematics, medicine, and monumental architecture. But these gifts were purchased with the freedom, dignity, and lives of enslaved women whose contributions were systematically erased from the civilization they helped build. We celebrate Egyptian innovation while forgetting that innovation was powered by feminine suffering on an industrial scale. The Egyptian obsession with permanence, with creating monuments that would last forever, succeeded beyond imagination. The pyramids still stand. The temples still inspire awe. The artifacts still gleam in museums worldwide. But the enslaved women who made it all possible were deliberately excluded from that permanence. They were denied mummification, proper burial, afterlife preparation, even the basic recording of their names. This erasure was intentional. Egyptian civilization required enslaved women's labor, but couldn't acknowledge their humanity without undermining the ideological foundations of slavery itself. So they were erased from art, except as furniture, erased from texts, except as property listings, erased from religious consideration, except as potential sacrifices, erased from death rituals, except as grave goods, erased from memory, except as the absent presence that made everything else possible. Modern Egyptology has been complicit in this erasure. For decades, scholars focused on pharaohs and pyramids while ignoring the enslaved populations that made royal luxury possible. Museums display treasures without acknowledging the enslaved hands that created them. Documentaries celebrate architectural achievements without mentioning the women who died building them. Only recently have archaeologists begun examining workers' cemeteries with the same attention given to royal tombs. Only now are bioarchaeologists analyzing trauma patterns in female skeletons to understand enslaved women's experiences. Only in the last few decades have scholars begun asking, where are the women in the archaeological record? Why are they absent from texts? How many unmarked graves surround each monument we admire? The answers are emerging from sand and silence. Each excavation reveals more evidence of massive enslaved populations, predominantly female. Each skeletal analysis tells another story of a life ground down by labor. Each chemical test of ancient mortar finds human blood, silent testimony to bodies built into the structures themselves. But for every woman we discover, hundreds remain lost, their bones scattered by wind, their graves disturbed by development, their stories untold because no one bothered to record them. They exist as statistical shadows, demographic implications, the necessary but unnamed foundation of a civilization we still admire despite knowing its cost. The Nubian teenager from our opening would have watched her mother die from exhaustion, her sister from pregnancy complications, her daughter from malnutrition. She would have served the same family that destroyed hers, cooking for the children of the man who killed her father, cleaning the room of the woman who ordered her branding. She would have lived every day knowing that her suffering meant nothing to anyone, that her death would be noted only as an inconvenience to her owners. Yet she survived 5 decades in bondage. She endured tortures we can barely imagine. She maintained enough humanity to leave traces in the archaeological record. Her bones, telling the story Egyptian texts refused to record. Her skeleton, that fused knee testament to endless labor, speaks across millennia about the price of civilization's glory. She deserves more than archaeological analysis. She deserves the recognition that her suffering built wonders we still celebrate. She deserves acknowledgement that her humanity was complete, despite systematic attempts to deny it. She deserves to have her story told, even if we'll never know her name. They all deserve this recognition. The millions of enslaved women whose labor built monuments, whose bodies bore future generations of slaves, whose suffering was reframed as divine order. The women who were captured in wars they didn't start, sold in markets they didn't create, branded with symbols they couldn't read, and buried in graves they couldn't mark. Egypt's true history isn't just gold and gods. It's the systematic enslavement, abuse, and erasure of millions of women whose only crime was being captured by a civilization powerful enough to deny their humanity completely. It's about abuse reframed as honor, murder disguised as sacrifice, and suffering transformed into architectural achievement. When we admire Egyptian artifacts, we must remember the enslaved women who created them. When we study hieroglyphics, we must acknowledge they record a civilization built on feminine suffering. When we visit pyramids, we must understand we're visiting monuments to systematic human bondage. When we celebrate Egyptian achievements, we must recognize those achievements were purchased with enslaved women's blood. The sands of Egypt hold more than treasures. They hold the bones of millions of women whose names were never recorded, whose lives were valued less than cattle, whose deaths weren't mourned, whose humanities were denied so thoroughly that we only know they existed through the damage patterns in their skeletons. But knowing they existed changes everything. It transforms pyramids from monuments to graveyards. It reveals golden artifacts as blood gold. It exposes celebrated pharaohs as human traffickers. It reframes Egyptian civilization as a machine for converting human suffering into permanent monuments. The Nubian teenagers' bones were recently moved to a climate-controlled storage facility where they're cataloged as specimen EA7892. Even in death, she's reduced to a number. But at least now she's being studied, her story slowly emerging from calcium and mineral deposits. Scientists can tell she had children from pelvic scarring, that she suffered from chronic malnutrition from bone density, that she lived with constant pain from joint damage. They cannot tell us what she thought about while grinding grain for 40 years, what she dreamed about during the few hours of sleep slavery allowed, whether she remembered her homeland or had those memories beaten out of her, whether she loved her children despite knowing they would suffer as she suffered, whether she found moments of joy in a life designed to deny them. These interior worlds of enslaved women remain forever lost, erased as thoroughly as their names. But their physical suffering left marks that time cannot erase. Every fused joint, every compression fracture, every wear pattern tells a story of endurance that transcends the civilization that tried to erase it. Egypt did not simply rule. It consumed. It consumed women's bodies through labor, their dignity through systematic humiliation, their children through inherited bondage, their deaths through denial of proper burial, and their memories through deliberate erasure from historical record. Its glory was built on women condemned to vanish in the sands. But the sands are finally giving up their secrets. Each excavation recovers another erased woman. Each skeletal analysis tells another suppressed story. Each DNA test connects another nameless skeleton to the human family. The enslaved women ancient Egypt tried to erase are slowly, painstakingly, being recovered from the silence. They deserved better than they received in life. They deserve better than they've received in history. They deserve to have their suffering acknowledged as the true cost of the monuments we admire. They deserve to be remembered. and through their bones they will be. If this glimpse into history's hidden darkness has left you wanting to uncover more buried truths, I've prepared another journey into the shadows of the past that you won't want to miss. Click on the video appearing on your screen now to discover another shocking chapter that history tried to erase. And if you found this exploration as compelling as I did, hit that subscribe button so we can continue peeling back the layers of history together. These forgotten voices deserve to be heard, and there are so many more stories waiting to be told.